he's one of these artists who hardly ever did a bad painting. It's just phenomenal, the amount of work and the quality of the work and his story. And he also painted for 70 years.
Oh my God.
You know, he lived into his 80s, 85, I think, if I remember rightly. And painting to the end, though he was having terrible trouble with his sight at the end. So, this is a portrait by Renoir, which is an excellent portrait of Monet, I think. Renoir was a very good portraitist. They were very close friends, too, for a long time. As you'll see as I go along, there were problems later on. But anyway, Monet was born in 1840, as it says here, in Paris. But when he was 5, the father moved the family to Le Havre on the mouth of the River Seine on the Normandy coast, where he set up a grocery shop that was also a chandlery, which a chandlery being a business that outfits vessels. So of course, Le Havre being a major port, a lot of his business was providing everything for the ships. And he assumed, of course, that his son would join him in the business. But Monet from early on was interested in art and encouraged by an aunt especially, and also by his mother, who was a singer. And he went in 1851, he attended a secondary school for the arts in Le Havre. And while he was there studying, he met a painter on the coast, Boudin. First I should say this. Before he met Boudin, his main interests were caricatures.
That's Monet?
That's Monet. He did that at age 15.
Wow.
God.
He would do these caricatures and he put them in the window of his father's business, which is interesting because Turner did something of the same thing when he was a young man. Mm-hmm. And he sold them. I mean, I don't think he made a lot of money for them, but he sold them. He made money off this. And he was quite good at it, as you can see. But while he was studying art and he met Boudin, who I should say a few words about him, actually, Eugene Boudin, who was quite a bit older than Monet, but whose father had a stationery and picture frame business in Le Havre. And when he was young and working in his father's business, after a stint working on a steamship, he met quite a few artists and became familiar with the Barbizon school. And he also met a Dutch artist who painted a lot in France, Jean Keen, who advised him to paint outdoors, which he started doing. So he met Monet and he encouraged him to do the same thing, and they painted together. And these are a couple of Boudin's paintings to give you some idea. He was a really fine painter. His whole subject, though, pretty much were port and seascape scenes, and river scenes too, but excellent scenes. And he actually showed a lot of the in the salon and was quite well regarded later on. These are later than these were painted later than when he met Monet, but they give a sense of the quality of his work. And under Boudin's influence and becoming aware also of the Barbizon school, Monet painted pictures like this, which, let me look at the date of that. That's 1850, oh, wait a minute. It's 1858. So he hasn't, he's now 18. It's an excellent painting. in that manner, I think. Reminiscent a little of Constable. Around the same time, actually, quite a few years later, a painting which also shows the influence of Baudin. I mean, it's interesting to me because if you look at this painting, the water looks like it's hidden by clouds because there's no note of blue, but the sky has this very strong blue in it. So I think the water and the sky were painted at different times, all probably on the same day as the weather changed. But it's a very effective painting. Okay, he showed some of these seascapes and got them in the he got to show them in the salon, but he wanted to do something which would really impress the salon. So he painted this picture of, well, at this point, this woman, Camille, was his girlfriend. Later they would marry. And this was a large painting, and it was designed to impress the academics, and it did. And in fact, he was likened to Monet. And you can see why. I mean, it's a very competent painting of his manner. I think he painted in 4 days, if I remember.
Oh my gosh.
And it's, you know, she's almost life size, I believe, in the original painting. But he was, so he got such a good review for the last one, he decided to do something really ambitious outdoors, which is how he wanted to be painting. And this painting was so big, I don't know the exact size, but it was so big that he had a ditch built in his garden and pulleys so he could raise and lower the painting to the right height to paint different parts of it. And one day while he's waiting for the right light, Courbet arrived because he hung with these paintings at various times. They all admired him at the time. And Courbet said, "Why aren't you painting?" And Monet said, "I'm waiting for the right light," which Courbet didn't understand because Courbet was not that interested. I mean, obviously he paid attention to light, but he wasn't that interested in light. He was interested in the physicality of things. But I think this is quite a lovely early painting and very ambitious. And this is a gorgeous painting from around the same period. And it also, you see something that will continue throughout his career, gardens and figures in gardens. And slowly the gardens become more important than the figures. But he was an avid gardener. Now, this is around the time that he and Renoir and Sisley and Pissarro are all painting together. And this is the point, this is the moment when they paint La Grenouille, which means the frog, actually, the froggery, Grenouillère.
Yeah.
This was where Parisians came on the Ile-de-France to hang out and swim and socialize. And here's a painting of it, almost exactly the same view by Renoir, painted the same day. You can see they're really inspiring each other. But whereas Monet goes for the overall light and shadow and color scheme and doesn't pay that much attention to the figures, really, Renoir is more interested in the figures. And his overall structure of the painting is much less decisive than Monet's, and his use of color is much less adventurous. Though it's a lovely painting. But this is the moment, and it's interesting that it was water and the reflections in water that really liberated that color and made them begin to see what was possible. And this has no bearing really on art history, but it is interesting that Corot, Baudin, Sisley, Renoir, Monet, Pissarro, they're all water signs. and all the different forms of water fascinate them. Another form of water. And it's actually in this painting, Monet painted many winter scenes with Pissarro. This one he painted alone when he was staying in a friend's house, and this is the largest one he ever did. But he's also discovering how to use color in shadows here for one of the first times. And it's the snow that enables him to do that, because he's put a little bit of yellow in the light and a little bit of blue-violet in the shadows. And the impact is just, and then a little tiny bit of yellow in here to contrast, yellow-orange to contrast with the violet. It's a wonderfully harmonious and brilliant painting, I think. Well, so the Impressionists started to get a grip on what they were doing. And then, of course, there's the Franco-Prussian War, which keeps raising its ugly head. He heads for the coast, Le Havre, obviously to go to England. But on the way, he paints with Baudin. And this is one of the paintings. And you see, he's now reflecting Baudin again, and Baudin's style. This is probably his wife, Camille, Monet's partner, and Baudin's wife here. So he arrives in London. In England, in London especially, he painted a whole bunch of pictures, but they weren't that well received. They were refused by the Academy. But this is interesting because he will return to the Thames to do a series that are really famous much later and very different from this. From London, he interestingly, he went to Holland for a few weeks. And I think partly he went because Jean Keen was Dutch and had advised him early on. But also, there's lots of water there. And I think this is just a charming painting. The undulation of the water, you almost feel like you're in a vessel, which he must have been when he painted this. And that you're moving very slightly with the undulations of the water. They had a child a few years before, of course. This is Jean at around 5, I believe. They are now live back on the Ile-de-France actually they're I'm trying to remember exactly where they're living at this point. Well, sorry for the Argenteuil. How do you say that? Does anyone know? Argenteuil, I believe, which was a little town with very little industry on the Seine, and they're living in absolute poverty. In fact, the creditors are chasing them. Around the time that this painting is painted, Claude Monet has a show of marine paintings in Le Havre, which is very successful, and he receives a silver medal and sells a lot of work. But the work that isn't sold is all seized by creditors, because he has all these creditors who are chasing him around all the time. And this is true up until the time he becomes successful. He's always one step ahead of creditors, often moving just to get away from them. And this is, I think, a lovely painting of Camille. With a very, again, he's a colorist, but look how he controls his palette. Look how limited the color is and how subtle the color variation is on her dress between the the soft blues with a touch of green in them, and the light pinks, which creates a wonderful contrast and sets off very well against these rich greens behind. This is about the time that Monet started painting with them. And I can't help but see the influence of Monet in this painting. Monet is playing around with blacks, which he doesn't generally use that much. And the way the figures are set up and become a key element in the painting too. Very beautiful painting. Incredible looseness now in his work, but very, very effective paintings. He got a little extra money, and he bought a boat and had a little studio put on it. So this is his studio boat. Also extremely economically painted, if you think about it. You can see the raw canvas under many of his brushstrokes. One of my very favorite Monet paintings, and I think it was extremely popular at the time among people who appreciated his work. You got to remember, he's in the salon, he's being, to the extent that the salon even sees him, they mostly criticize him. And he's not selling that well, even at the Impressionist exhibitions. But this is a lovely work. And keep it in mind, because he repaints this painting later, but with a different woman. Around this time, Camille was diagnosed with TB. And I suspect that he was staying closer to home. This is very close to where they lived. And it's interesting because he's actually put some hints of industry in this painting with the flowers, but it has a certain melancholy feel to it. Maybe I'm reading that in, but that's the way it seems to me. Also, maybe because he wanted to stay close to home, he started to paint the Gare Saint-Lazare. The Gare Saint-Lazare was literally 7 miles from La Grenouille, Argenteuil, or however you pronounce the place. I'm sorry, my French is very bad these days. And it's one of the first clear series paintings, though it's not necessarily just about light. But he does a whole number of paintings of the Gare, which, if you remember, these two are very interesting because the composition is almost exactly the same, but the lighting is quite different. I suspect that these paintings may have been partly inspired by Turner's Rain, Steam, and Speed. But also, if you remember, Monet did that painting of a woman with a daughter in front of the fence in front of the Gare Saint-Lazare.
Yeah.
A few years before. And Monet and Manet were very close. They were very good friends. Manet did not like Renoir's work very much, but he deeply admired Monet. I think it's one of the few times that a painter has painted his wife on her deathbed. She's dead at this point. He was obsessed with catching the colors as they changed on her face. He admitted to a friend. But it's been described as a blizzard of grief by one critic. Very sad painting. So at the point that she died, he was living with a patron. He and his family was living with a patron, Ernest Hosaget, who was a financier of some sort. And Ernest's wife, Alice, was helping the family. And since she had 4 kids and he had 2 kids, she was and she was also nursing Camille. Well, shortly after this, Ernest suffered a bankruptcy and raced back to Paris to deal with his affairs, leaving them in the house, his children and Alice and Monet, and they actually initiated a relationship. And after Ernest died a few years, that was the end of her relationship with Ernest. And after he died, they married, actually, because in those days you couldn't marry if you were already married. So some years later, we're moving now because there's so much to cover. I've edited, but some years later he explores Liguria in Italy, the western coast of Italy, and this is an unfinished painting. I think it's instructive. This is how he starts the painting. He's blocking in values and he's blocking in color, not as intense as he will finally put it down. But and there's no line drawing, remember, notice. He's just working with paint. He also, the last one was, by the way, called Acqua Dolce. Sweetwater is the name of the town, actually, Acqua Dolce. He then, these two I like. He then goes to Bordighera, which is also along that coast, and he does something he can't resist doing now, different lighting. Kind of interesting, and he really does capture the sense of the Mediterranean in these paintings, I think. But look how loose his details are on the buildings here, Julie, if you're still with us. Oh, Julie's gone too. Oh my goodness. Maybe I'm talking. Oh, there she is.
There, she's there.
Okay, good. Look how he states the buildings in here. Oops, sorry. And somewhat later, he paints Antibes. In order to paint Antibes, which was a fortified city in France along the waterfront, he had to get permission from the government because it was considered a strategic asset. And painters were always suspected of being spies. So he had to have papers from the government in Paris saying that he was allowed to paint Antibes, which meant he had to wait several weeks before he could actually paint it. Another one of Antibes, which I love, because he really captures the nature of that incredibly rich color that the Mediterranean can have. He also, at this point, his ambition is to paint all the major areas of France, and he goes about it the way he did everything. He goes on what he calls campaigns, where he goes somewhere and stays for several weeks or months and paints 30, 40 paintings. And one of the places he really loved to paint was this Etretat, the cliffs of Etretat, which is on the Normandy coast, not that far actually from Le Havre. And here again, he's playing with different lighting on the same subject. But it's when he decides to go to Brittany, actually to an island off the coast of Brittany on the Atlantic coast, that he really gets into painting series of the same thing in different lights, because he discovers along this part of the coast, which kind of resembles a little bit parts of the west coast of California and north of here too. Looks like basalt to me, but I'm not sure. But everything changes so fast. 1 minute is cloudy, the next is sunny, that he just has different canvases and just moves back and forth between them. He planned to go to this island for a month, and he ends up spending 3 months there painting and producing over 40 paintings. And he wrote to his wife, oh no, to a friend, I am in a wonderfully wild region with terrifying rocks and a sea of unbelievable colors. Even though it is difficult, because I got used to painting the channel and I knew how to go about it, but the Atlantic Ocean is quite different. Another one. And this, it's interesting, the difference between these two. See here, it's a hazy sky and he probably isn't getting any direct sunlight. Very powerful paintings, but very loose. Remember the other painting? Mm-hmm. This one is of Alice. And it's interesting. It reminds me a little bit of when we looked at Rubens and he did the two paintings of his two wives in the same pose. Remember? But this, to me, this doesn't hold a candle to the other painting. Well, Alice was getting pretty fed up with his campaigns where he'd disappear for 2 or 3 months at a time. And she was also apparently somewhat jealous of him. So she thought he was, I don't think she could believe that he was just painting the whole time, which he was. But so he decided to take on these are actually grain stacks, not haystacks, though they're usually called haystacks, because they're storing all the grain, you know, on the stems of the hay, and then they're going to winnow it later. But he did an enormous series. I don't know how many paintings. There must have been 20 or 30 paintings or more of these grain stacks in all different kinds of weather. He also did them in the snow, but I've just taken a couple of them of exactly the same view, actually, which is interesting. But look how loose he's getting in his work now. He's going for areas of color and mood, and just enough information that you can see the landscape and see the haystacks. Grain stacks. Well, after the grain stacks, he picked something else really nearby, which was there were these poplars along a little river, the Ept, which was near his house. And he'd been eyeing them for a long time. And then he learned that they were the farmer who owned this portion of the land was going to sell them for lumber. So he went and bought all the trees, which he sold later to recoup his investment after he painted them. He did a whole series, but he really got into the vertical accent of the very thin trunks and this kind of movement of the trees into the distance. And look at the simplicity of this one. And yet a very successful painting, but it's really as simple as you might find a Picasso or a Matisse to be. It's really reduced to its elements. Well, he now embarks on another campaign. He was very astute. He was a good businessman who, even though they lived in the beginning in poverty and always without very much money until he became successful, he could always sell work. He was never as poor as some of the other Impressionists. And here there was a kind of, France was recovering from its defeat from the Prussians. And there was this national pride building up. And I think he realized that painting a Catholic church like this, making it the subject of his studies, would be very popular. And it was. But what's really interesting about this series of Rouen, and he did, I think, 40 paintings in all, from 2 different vantage points, hotel rooms, was that in the entire time he painted these, he never entered the church. He wasn't interested in the church. He was interested in the lighting on the facade of the church. And, but of course it wasn't interpreted that way by the viewers. And of course, you remember, he'd been raised Catholic, but he was an atheist. So, well, while this was a show that made his name, and the first time that his series was shown all together. And one of the people who saw it was a statesman and writer and journalist, Georges Clemenceau, who was blown away by these paintings and made a point of making Monet's acquaintance, and they hit it off really well. Georges Clemenceau was also an avid gardener. And for the rest of their relationship, which would go on for 30 years or more, they would trade information about gardening, including seeds and bulbs. But right around the time he makes Clemenceau's acquaintance, there's the beginning of a huge scandal which will just rock France and split the Impressionists apart forever. It's the Dreyfus affair. Dreyfus was an officer in the French army who happened to be from Alsace. If you remember, Alsace-Lorraine had been given to the Prussians. So members of the army who were from that region were under a little bit of extra surveillance. And there was some evidence that someone was giving information to the Prussians, and he was finally fingered on the basis actually of no real evidence. It was trumped up evidence. Now, he wasn't just from Alsace, which was the first thing that caught their attention, plus a handwritten note, which they thought he'd written, which he hadn't. He was also Jewish. So once they decided to make him the, had picked him as their suspect, and they were going to go after him, the fact that he was Jewish was something they used to turn the public against him. And it created this terrible furor. He was convicted of passing secrets. He was sentenced to life in a Devil's Island, and he was publicly humiliated, where they tore all his medals in public off his uniform and broke his sword. And he was shipped out to Devil's Island across the Atlantic. Well, within a couple of years of this event, evidence began to trickle out that, in fact, someone else was guilty, and he'd been framed. And Zola, who was at the height of his career, decided to take on this issue and wrote a scathing and very detailed article called J'accuse on the front, and it was published on the front page of La Figaro, which was run actually by Georges Clemenceau. Georges Clemenceau agreed with Zola and those who thought that this was a frame-up. Very shortly afterwards, Pissarro and Monet signed a petition calling for the release of Dreyfus, but Degas, who had always been anti-Semitic and had actually dropped remarks during the time when the Impressionists were all very close, dropped little remarks about Pissarro being Jewish, which Pissarro would just ignore, went into frenzies of anti-Semitism. And though Renoir didn't say a lot publicly, Renoir generally agreed with him. And we know about their conversations because Julia Manet, the daughter of, whose letter I read at the end of the last presentation, the daughter of Morisot, kept a diary. And if you remember, Renoir was, Renoir was a guardian. and Degas was also very close to her, but she kept an accurate diary of the conversations. So we know what they were saying. And it was, and Renoir was also quite anti-Semitic. He definitely disapproved of Jews in the military. And both Degas and Pizarro, both Degas and Renoir cut off Pizarro. They had no further dealings with him. Meanwhile, Cézanne, who after returning to Aix-en-Provence, kind of re-entered the Catholic Church and became very conservative. And though he didn't express strong anti-Semitism, he agreed with the government's position. But it basically split the Impressionists forever. And it also created an incredible schism in France, which lasted for a decade, because they finally brought Dreyfus back for a second trial and found him guilty again, and then pardoned him. That was their way of dealing with the whole thing. And it wasn't until 1906 that he was finally vindicated and re-entered the military. And he actually served in the First World War and died in 1935. It's an incredible story. But the level of anti-Semitism in France and the virulence of it is indicated in this painting. And I have to say, I can't remember who painted this painting. Let me get to it. There's Zola. Because what happened is Zola, by writing J'accuse, made himself the target. And he was put on trial for sedition and found guilty and sentenced to prison, at which point he fled to England. But this, I think, quite aptly describes the level of hysteria in France at the time. And this was the fertile bed on which the extermination of the Jews in the next century happened. You know, there was just anti-Semitism was throughout Europe at the time. Anyway, Monet became totally disenchanted with France and French politics and retreats to his garden and does not go on any more painting campaigns in the French countryside, or very few. And concentrates on developing this he has 7 gardeners because he's now successful and has a lot of money. And he actually designs the whole garden, giving every day he wrote out precise instructions to his gardeners on what to do and how to, landscape and how to plant. He spent a lot of time researching. He had a large collection of catalogs to buy his seeds and his bulbs. And so this was as much of an obsession as painting with him. But he also, when he wanted to go elsewhere, he went to England rather than continuing in France and painted on the Thames. And you can see here the very strong influence of Turner. And did a whole series there. He also, and continued his water lilies, of course. Originally, he painted the bridge in the pond, but then he got into just the water lilies. He also went with his wife, with Alice, in 1908, I believe. 1908, and painted in Venice for I think for 2 or 3 months, I believe. Again, doing his signature thing now of different lighting on often exactly the same position. I think these two are very interesting. That would be their last trip together because she would die, I think, around, I'm not sure, but she would die shortly after that trip. And he basically at this point is just painting in his garden. And as the war First World War breaks out. He loses his son, Jean, at the very beginning of the war. Some of his, he did a whole series of weeping willows, which actually you can see it reflected here, which had to do with his feeling of grief around the war. But at this point, his eyesight, he's beginning to have very serious problems with cataracts. And actually, he's labeling his colors and making sure he knows where they are, because he can't see color very well anymore. And it's a little like Beethoven painting deaf. He's beginning to paint almost blind. And complains about this extensively. And you can see the colors are shifting. And some of this is his choice, and some of this is outside of his control. So lovely paintings, but at times everything goes a kilter like this. This is the Rose Arbor or Rose Walkway, but it to me it's very unsatisfying, and you get the feeling that he doesn't really know exactly how to manage the color anymore. Well, during the same time, his relationship with Clemenceau has deepened, and they hatch a plan that at the end of the war, he will give a very ambitious series of paintings that he's creating, these huge water lily pond paintings that are now in the Orangerie, to France as a way of healing from the terrible suffering of the First World War. And this is Clemenceau with Claude in his garden. They wrote to each other constantly. They were very, very close, working on the series that will eventually go into the Orangerie, and complaining that he can't see what he's doing. Finally, Clemenceau finally convinces him to have cataract surgery. And he's not very happy with the result, because in those days you didn't get a lens, you just got the lens taken out, and then you had to wear these very thick glasses. And he complained about the distortion of everything due to these big fat lenses. But he could see color again. And he went back through a lot of his paintings and corrected them. So it was necessary to finishing this project too. Well, Clemenceau got word when he was in Paris that Monet was dying, and he jumped in his car and he goaded his driver to drive at breakneck speed, got to the house, rushed into Monet's house, rushed up to his bedroom and embraced him, and Monet died in his arms. So one has to say that in many ways Monet was a very lucky man.
How old was he when he died?
Just a second, 1840 to 1925, so 85.
85, okay, that's pretty good.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah. And he was a workhorse. He never stopped working. You've got to, you've got to admire his incredible persistence. There were a couple of things I failed to say earlier, which I think I should say, and it had to do with his beginnings when he first came to Paris after he'd been painting on the coast with Baudin. He went to the Louvre to copy and decided not to, and instead set up his easel in front of the windows of the Louvre and painted the views outside. He's the only painter to ever do that, I think, at that time. But it demonstrates just what a nonconformist this man was and how independent he was. And one other thing I've neglected to say, which I think is important, understanding him and his relationship with his father. He was drafted and was sent with the light cavalry to Algiers when he was 16. His father could have bought him out of service, but because he refused to give up painting, his father refused to buy him out. He got typhus after a year, and his aunt bailed him out. And when he came back to France, he lived with his aunt, not with his father. So sorry, I left that out of the beginning because I don't really have a script. I just have notes. But that's Monet.